Unlike other card games, Yu-Gi-Oh's board is set in stone, meaning that you have a specific number of zones in specific parts of the playing field. In games like Magic the Gathering or Pokemon, the board is a lot more loose with just general areas to place your cards in, nothing like Yu-Gi-Oh's 5 monsters and spell and trap card zones. Neither of them is necessarily better than the other, just different approaches to game design. However, one thing Yu-Gi-Oh's strict board allows that other games don't is card designs based around which specific zone of the field they occupy. Most notably among them are columns. Ever since GX's Cyberdark Impact, column-based mechanics have been present in a few cards throughout the years, but never quite achieving a relevant presence. So today, let's take a look at what cards comprise this failed mechanic and why it failed if it truly did. We'll start where all good stories do, at the beginning. Cyberdark Impact was released in November of 2006, and was met with disdain from the community since it lacked any relevant cards, and actually featured a bunch of weird new designs that were mediocre at best. We were introduced to themes like cards which cared about what chain link they were activated in, such as Combo Master. We also got the very underwhelming Cyberdark archetype, which gave the set its name, which would have to wait until 2021 to be anything resembling playable. With time, however, Cyberdark Impact has aged like a fine wine in some regards. Snipe Hunter, Vanity's Fiend, and Vanity's Ruler, all 6 barrier statues, Instant Fusion, Chain Strike, and Black Horn of Heaven were released in this pack, making for a set that had quite a large impact in the long run. But among its many underwhelming themes, the least represented one was the one which we'll be looking at today, columns. 3 monsters and 1 trap card with column-based effects were released in the set. Rampaging Rhinos, Storm Shooter, Alien Infiltrator, and Blasting Fuse. All of these suck. Sorry for all of you 3 Storm Shooter control enjoyers, but these really didn't do anything. Up until this point, Yu-Gi-Oh players had the tendency to just put their cards wherever on the field, mostly placing them center in the field for the sake of symmetry, since it didn't matter which zone they occupied, until now. The release of these 4 cards meant that, from then on, players had to start paying attention to where they placed their cards, or be subject to judge calls, or simply to a gameplay disadvantage. They didn't though. Since these cards were so awfully bad, if you played in any half-serious setting, you could very safely assume that nobody was playing these cards. And nobody did for the next 11 years. Column-based effects were shelved for good, and we saw no new cards of these sorts of effects for years to come. This lack of column-based effects lasted until 2017. Code of the Duelist introduced Link Summoning, which fundamentally changed how Yu-Gi-Oh was played in more than one way. Since Link monsters featured arrows that would point to specific zones, and you needed those to summon monsters from your extra deck, players actually had to start paying attention to where on the field they placed their cards. With this newborn need to actually pay attention to which zones you played your cards in, Konami decided to bring back cards that cared about columns, being a mainstay in card design from this point forward. But as we'll see, quantity does not equal quality. During the Vrains era second booster pack Circuit Break, we found 2 cards that expanded on this design which originated a decade prior. Fus Line and Broken Line. The latter did see some sporadic play, being a solid side deck card in Eldritch decks during Drytron format, as an easy out to Herald of Ultimateness. Funnily enough, while Broken Line's effect is very strong, albeit limited to where your opponent plays their cards, it actually shines going second, since you could just set it up in the same column as your opponent's big bad boss monster, and easily remove it on the crackback when it activates its effect. Fus Line, however, wasn't as lucky, never seeing any play and only being relevant for its weird card text, which allows you to, while the card remains set, to target and destroy a card in its same column. Weirdly enough, the while this card is set doesn't affect how you play the card, but only exists to prevent it from being used with Junk Controller and other similar effects that can copy the effect. In the next set, Extreme Force, we continue with these designs, introducing the first Pendulum Spirit monsters in Yokozuna Sumo Spirit and Kuroobi Karate Spirit, which could send either all monsters or all spell trap cards in their same column when they were normal summoned too. Much more importantly, we saw the release of a full archetype revolving around mechanics, the Mech Knights. This archetype was the 3rd one to be part of the World Legacy storyline, and it was the first to really focus on paying attention to columns. All Mech Knight monsters could summon themselves from the hand to a column where 2 or more cards were in. They could then have an additional effect like dodging targeting and searching with Mech Knight Purple Nightfall, or adding cards from the deck to your hand up to the number of your opponent's cards that are in the same column as Mech Knight Blue Sky. On release, these shifty boys didn't quite make the impact you'd expect from an archetype with 2 secret rares and an ultra, being mostly shoved aside as a mediocre going second deck. Because, well, that's all it was. However, hunger breeds innovation, and players quickly noticed that the Mech Knights were all light attribute, didn't require a normal summon, and had a bunch of useful toolbox effects, making for the perfect shell to play Invoked in. The Invoke cards are an engine centered around Alistair the Invoker and Invocation, which bring out a variety of fusions with him and monsters with different attributes. Previous to this point, it had seen success with the Windwitch engine, which enabled access to wind monsters so you could summon Invoked Ragin. Their most powerful fusion, however, always was Invoked Makaba, the light monster which can negate and banish any card. To this point, there simply wasn't a good light archetype which could house Alistair and his fusions. However, it still wasn't enough to push the deck into competitive viability, but still making for a solid rogue deck. After Extreme Force, we received one of the most impactful sets of all time in Flames of Destruction. This set introduced very powerful cards such as Altergeist Multifaker, Nightmare Corruptor Eebly, Ghostspell and Haunted Mansion, all the Nightmare monsters, and most importantly, Infinite Impermanence. Konami really amped up their game regarding generic column effects, giving us almost 10 new cards to look at. Of course, we continue the Spirit Pendulum theme with Kaiden Kendo Spirit, which saw play in certain Endymion brews. We also saw the now infamous Yajiro Invader, whose overcomplicated effect led to a bunch of really silly combo decks that never had any sort of relevance, but led to some pretty crazy replays you've probably already seen on some other people's channels. Red-haired Hasty Horse saw some play in Speedroid decks as an easy-to-summon extender, and Iron Dragon Taimonton was experimented with as a going second hand trap with a big upside, but a surprisingly hard to achieve activation condition. There were also some much less relevant cards like Transfamiliar or Styrian Contests, but as we mentioned before, Flames of Destruction brought upon us some of the most played cards since the game's release, including Infinite Impermanence. This trap card can be activated from your hand if you control no cards on your side of the field to target and negate a monster on your opponent's side of the field, making it a literal hand trap. The effect that matters to us, though, is that if this card was set before you activated, all spell and trap cards in that card's column are negated for the rest of the turn. If Mech Knights made players start to play around placing two cards in the same column, Infinite Impermanence effectively gave Yu-Gi-Oh players PTSD about activating cards in the same column as a set card. Cards like Gorz the Emissary of Darkness, Mirror Force, Nibiru the Primal Being, and many others have impacted the way people play the game at a very small scale from play to play, and Infinite Impermanence had an equal or larger impact than all. To this day, people play around Infinite Impermanence no matter the situation, and it's for good reason. I don't think there's anyone who hasn't lost a game to fumbling a spell into an Imperm column. But I mean, if you've been playing this game at all after this card's release, you've probably already known how ever-present this card is. And this is where this video finds its match. One of the game's most impactful cards is a column-based effect. How can we call column-based mechanics a failure when one of the game's most played cards is a column card? Well, this is certainly the exception to the rule. Matter of fact, Infinite Impermanence was so good, Konami has yet to release another good column-based card. Around the same time of Impermanence release, we found our second column-based archetype. In the deck build Spirit Warriors, we received the Weather, an archetype themed around painters who illustrate the weather, focused around banishing and using their continuous spells and traps, their canvases, to grant effects to their columns and adjacent zones. Although all their cards had like a dozen effects, this didn't materialize into any sort of viability, only gaining a little traction when the Weather Forecast was released years later, but still only remaining a mediocre rogue deck. And it seems like Konami liked the idea of including these weird column archetypes on deck build packs, as we got Magical Musketeers in the very same pack. This archetype, based on an 1821 German opera of all things, is focused around low-level monsters that allow you to activate Musketeer spell and traps directly from your hand, and gain an additional effect when you activate one of them in their same column. While these cards were called the Neck Zodiac, this hype failed to convert into any real viability, being reduced to an overpriced, unplayable mess. While they had access to very powerful cards like Magical Musketeer Casper and Magical Musket Cross Domination, it just couldn't match up to their competition. Time, however, would grant them one of the most broken support cards yet seen, Magical Musketeer Max. This Link 1 can either search up to 5 spell traps or summon up to 5 monsters directly from the deck. But alas, even this piece of broken support was not enough to bring the deck into any sort of relevance. After this point, we saw a drastic drop off in the amount of column-based effects that were released, having to wait until much later to see the next installment. In 2021, we saw the release of Blazing Vortex, widely considered to be one of the worst sets of all time. This booster pack featured the all-powerful Pot of Prosperity and the not-so-powerful S-Forces. For today, our attention will go to the latter, even with how much of a disappointment they actually were. This archetype tried to continue the design that Mech Knight started, coupled with pretty interesting theme of dual law enforcement, but it didn't even manage to achieve its predecessor's relevance. Indeed, where Mech Knights gained proactive advantage and interacted with your opponent's cards in the same column, S-Forces set up mediocre floodgate effects, like S-Force Dog Tag negating your opponent's monster's effects in S-Force columns, but only during your turn, or S-Force Night Chaser making it so your opponent can't attack monsters in the same column as theirs. These are just bad. Even with such a powerful card like S-Force Rappa Chiyomaru, the deck just never did anything at all, which really sums up what column-based effects do. But hey, Chiyomaru ended up becoming SP Little Knight, one of the best Link monsters of all time. We'd have to wait another year until 2022's Tactical Masters to have our next and for now, last column-based archetype. In an amazing deck building pack that gave us both Runic and Labyrinth, decks which have been consistently relevant in one way or another, we also received Veilance. Ever since 2018, when Pendulum decks were last relevant, Konami has had to really overcompensate card design to accommodate for Heavy Metal Foes Electromite's existence in the OCG. This originally caused a drought of Pendulum decks after the release of Endymion, but the long-term effects were even worse. Indeed, we had to cope with Sulfachords and Veilance until we were getting something decent in the form of Draco Slayers. To be honest, I don't think there's an archetype that scares Yuki Boomers quite like Veilance. It's a Pendulum deck, the hardest mechanic to wrap your head around, every card is a massive essay, and the deck combos for hours. Not everyone's cup of tea for sure. And when you read that they can search Senate Switch, you start realizing that it's not worth your time to read through this archetype's massive text boxes. This deck's entire purpose is to make you confused for 10 minutes, then wondered why you got FTK'd or why there's a fossil Diny Petrocephalo and a secret village of spellcasters on the field. Even though cards like Mamonaka the Veilance United and Shinonome Veilance Priestess read like crazy pieces of cardboard, the deck is just plain bad, underwhelming, and overly complex. And that's pretty much where we're at right now, the current end of a long list of failures. But why were they failures? Is it even possible to make a column-based archetype viable? Let's see. Firstly, we need to analyze what these decks do. We'll be ignoring Veilance for this, since this one is its own can of worms we'll get into in due time. Both Mech Knight and S-Force care about what your opponent is doing on their side of the field, and act accordingly. On paper, you might think this is not a bad thing necessarily. Most, if not all decks, care about what your opponent does, specifically going second ones. But both decks' designs are centered around what your opponent's cards are, not what they do. This might not seem like such a big deal, but it truly is. A more apt comparison would be to pair these decks up with two other failures, Mech Lords and Ally of Justice. Both these archetypes care about a specific characteristic of your opponent's cards. Mech Lords care about your opponent having Synchro monsters, and Ally of Justice care about your opponent having light monsters. While it's true what columns your opponent's playing is a lot more generic, it isn't that much better. You are highly dependent on how and what your opponent is playing. If you're going second, then your opponent can just play around your Mech Knights and not place two cards in the same column. If you're going first, then your opponent can just not summon their monsters to the columns of your S-Force monsters that affect you. Of course, you have to play around cards and decks in any matchup, but when that playing around is just placing the cards in different zones, these decks just get countered by having a brain. Meanwhile, the Weather and Magical Musketeers are both just too telegraphed. The moment you start playing, your opponent is fully aware what your intentions are and how to play around them, making for decks which get countered by, once again, having object permanence. On the opposite side, we have much more interesting applications of column-based effects with Vanquished Soul. This fighting game themed style deck focuses on revealing different attributes to activate their monsters' effects, and has a couple of column-based effects. Vanquished Soul Raisin can destroy all other monsters in its column, and Vanquished Soul Pantera can do the same but for spells and traps. Lastly, Vanquished Soul Trinity Burst can return all cards your opponent controls in the same column as your Vanquished Soul cards. This is how these sorts of effects should be done in my opinion. Just good cards that work regardless of which column they're in, but have an upside you can exploit with smart playing. Especially since your opponent can't really play around your columns because you can bring them out with Raku the Vanquisher as a quick effect. Vanquished Souls brings agency into play while also keeping columns as a focal point of much of the archetype's identity. This agency was lacking in the game's past attempts at making column-based effects, and shows what I hope is the way forward to making this type of effect a mainstay in the game's future. So that's pretty much the history of why column-based mechanics were a failure in Yu-Gi-Oh!